Hey, hello, and welcome to the Evans Library podcast. We're doing our first interview here with Dr. Anna Muenchrath, who's assistant professor at Florida Tech, and her research interests include 20th and 21st century literature, theories of world literature and cultural production, literary sociology, translation studies, print culture, media studies, and book history. She's the author of Making World Literature, Actors, Institutions, and Networks in the United States since 1890, which was published with the University of Massachusetts Press in 2024, and Selling Books with Algorithms, published with Cambridge University Press also in 2024. Her work has appeared in the Journal of World Literature, Book History, American Literature, and College Literature, and she's also the 2025 Fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. And I have to say that Anna is probably one of the busiest faculty that I've met. Every time an email goes out, her name is somehow attached to it. Just so the Secretary of Faculty Senate, correct?
Yes, that's right.
This is your first year?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I was also Secretary of Faculty Senate. We can talk about that off.
Okay. It's an interesting job. I didn't know what I was signing up for when I signed up for it.
Yes. A lot of people say that. You're also leading these humanities discussions, which the first one I think is this afternoon.
Yeah, it's something we've been doing for a couple of years, but we haven't really been broadcasting it. It's part of a class. So if you are a major in the humanities, we do have some of those here at Florida Tech. You do a 4-class capstone sequence, and in the first semester of your senior year, you do a sort of research class. And since a lot of that work is done outside of class, we use the class to feature or showcase ongoing research by humanities faculty. And so we've been using that as like a work in progress seminar for faculty, but we haven't really invited it or, opened it for the rest of the Florida Tech community. So we're trying to do that more this year and say, if we're doing this anyways, people should come see what we're working on. So it's most Mondays from 3 to 5 in Skirlow 103, yes. From 3 to 3:50. So when the normal class meets.
Yeah. And it's really been interesting to me to see the reduction in humanities and the research and the humanities faculty, also the music program and things that we have here, which you wouldn't necessarily expect at a STEM or STEM-focused university. So that's always it's always exciting and interesting. I do think there's some sort of correlation between people who are good with math and musicians. And it seems like I meet a lot of people in IT, computer science, engineering, who are also musicians. I don't know what that is.
Yeah, we actually have a new director of the bands this year, Dr. Matt Towsey. And when I was getting to know him, he talked a lot about that too. Tech students seem to be interested in music because it's a similar sort of thing. You have inputs, you have outputs. You like to, you work as a team to try to make the end product better. So it is sort of an engineering thing in a way.
It is, yes. Yeah, it's interesting. So let's start off talking a little bit about your research, kind of how you got interested in kind of these two things, at least that I sort of know you for, which is kind of this world literature and like what gets translated into English and what doesn't. And then this idea of algorithms being used so much in book production, but also kind of our everyday lives. So you can maybe tell us a little bit about that, a little bit more about that and how you got interested in that area.
Sure. Originally, my focus was really on why we read what we read. So how do we get the book in front of us? What kind of process does that go through? Or really what forces are acting on that? So people don't think a lot about that. But if you're reading, Tolstoy or something, it's like someone had to choose that book to be translated. It had to be translated. It had to be, published in the US, and then it had to be made available. It had to be marketed. You had to be aware of it. It was probably put on a syllabus that you read somewhere in college. So there are all these forces at different points acting on that. And especially work in translation, right? Because it has to go through that one more step. We don't know about books that aren't translated usually. Or if we do, we can't read them unless they've been translated. So really, I was interested in the forces that act on that selection process. And then I was looking more into it. We might think readers make selections, but really they don't, right? They're the last sort of point of contact. Publishers make selections, translators, people like Oprah or Reese Witherspoon make selections. College professors make selections for their syllabi. But more recently, algorithms kind of help us with that selection process, right? So if you think, I'm interested in buying a book, instead of going to a bookstore, you might go to Amazon, and then you might have in front of you a couple of books available on the website, and you click on one of them and suddenly you see a couple more, and then you click on another one. And so you're basically interacting with the algorithm to produce what you're seeing and to make those selections. And so what I've been interested in recently is how algorithms might increase, decrease, change what is circulated and produced as world literature in the US.
Yeah, and it is interesting because it's not something I ever really thought much about, like this idea of what gets translated. Until, not too long ago, I was listening to a podcast. Somebody was doing research on, I think it was a German theologian. And then she was also working to translate that person's work into English, and then brought up this thing where that German theologian translated John Henry Newman from English into German. So then she's translating from German into English and then has to decide how does she translate Newman? Does she just go back to the original quote or what? It was interesting. But, and it kind of like, yeah, there's all of these books. I mean, I don't know, millions of books that are written in another language that I can't read. And that, I'll probably never have access to because it's not sort of worth maybe it's not cost effective maybe to translate those works into English. And you just think how much knowledge is out there that I'll never be able to touch.
Right. And the US is especially sort of translation poor in that respect. I think the number that's usually cited is 3% of works every year are in translation. It's even less if you're thinking about fiction only. So that includes nonfiction. Which is really, really low. Some countries have as high as 40, 50% of their publications every year are in translation. So we get so little. So it's even more interesting almost to me about, what is it that's getting translated and why? Is it, as you mentioned, there's a cost effectiveness that's a question because with translation, you don't only have to pay the author's royalties, you have to pay a translator to do that work. So there's usually foreign language rights. So there is a cost component. And then there's also, historically, what we've said about translation is that small translation publishers are on the lookout for the next Nobel Prize winner because their efforts are going to be repaid with that sort of cultural prestige. And so if you guess right, you're going to make a lot of money in the future. So most recently, I've been looking at Amazon Crossing, which is a new translation publisher, and they're not going that route at all. They're doing something that you would think is sort of common sense, which is they're translating what we call genre fiction. So that's like thrillers, romances, mysteries out of other languages. And so that's sort of, I'm thinking about some of those questions now, like why has no one done that before? It seems to be working for Amazon Crossing, but also why do it, right? Why read a mystery or a thriller from somewhere else if we have thrillers in the US and they're very formulaic, right? Very similar. So what are people getting out of reading a romance or a thriller in translation?
And I wonder too if that has something to do with like genre fiction is sort of like you'll never win a Nobel Prize for like the great thriller, right? It's sort of considered a lesser sort of reading and writing than just sort of general fiction or what have you.
Right. Definitely more popular. And I think the reason Amazon Crossing does that is because, it has all this data from people reading popular fiction, right? For example, their largest non-Anglophone marketplace is the German Amazon marketplace. And so they're translating a ton of German books. And I'm sort of thinking that that's because they have all of this data, all these ratings and reviews for German fiction. And they know, well, these are books that people here think are good, so people in the US will think they're good. It's almost flipping the script in that people used to think translation is really risky. You have to put all this money into it, and then maybe you'll get a return. Whereas now it's like, no, we can already know what sells somewhere else, and then we can just reproduce it, which in a way it makes commercial sense, of course. But literature scholars at least like to think that literature is a little bit different than like toilet paper or something else, where it's not just about what works one place works another place. So that's sort of what I'm doing now is looking at the data and seeing maybe what didn't work, right? What did they try to sell somewhere else and it didn't take off? We like to say that there's something untranslatable. When you translate something from one place to another place, the reason it's difficult is because, it's not the same people, it's not the same culture, it's not the same language. Things have to get lost and gained in that translation process. So, if Amazon Crossing worked perfectly, it would be sort of like a translation machine, and it would be, in a way, sort of depressing, right? Everything is the same everywhere. Everything works the same everywhere. So now what I'm interested in is sort of where does it not work, and what can we learn about translation from that?
Yeah. And translation, too, is really interesting because it's not just word for word. Like, you just can't go in and say, oh, that word means this in English. You have a lot of things that you have to kind of figure out what's the best word in English to describe this thing from French or German or wherever. And then, of course, you run up against idioms, which are very culturally specific and time specific. And so a German idiom that maybe expresses something really clearly in a German thriller it's just going to fall flat to it in English.
Right. And there's actually theories about how translators should handle that, right? So there's this famous translation scholar, his name is Lawrence Venuti. He talks about domesticating versus foreignizing translation, which it's basically the difference is bringing the book as closely to the reader as possible, or on the other hand, taking the reader to the book. So making, like, as you're reading, maybe you've read a book where you think, wow, I can really tell this has been translated. And you might even think this translation isn't very good, but maybe, right? The idea is, I don't want you to think you're consuming an American book, right? What would be the point of that? There's plenty of books from the US that you could read. Maybe the point is to have you be a little bit more uncomfortable, to make you feel like a stranger a little bit, so that's another word he uses, estrangement, to be estranged from the text, because it should be foreign, right? It's a foreign book.
It's interesting because I don't really read a lot of books that have been translated. But a few years ago, I was reading this biography of Pope Benedict XVI. And it was, and I started it off and I was like, something's a little off about this. And then I realized, because it was originally written in Italian by his papal secretary. And I was like, this is just I shouldn't say a weird or odd translation, but you could tell, like, it originally was not in English, just the way that the sentences kind of flowed in the way. And it really was, to me, kind of off-putting. Also because I'm dealing with this very difficult, like, German theologian's work that I don't understand anyway. and so now I've got this whole translation thing. And so it's interesting. Yeah.
Right. Well, and this goes back to sort of the Amazon crossing idea. Like, should it be, if we're doing data-driven translation, right? And it's like, these things will move really easily if that's our idea. This is sort of the same thing. If you're reading a book from elsewhere and you're like, I'm struggling or I'm stumbling over it. Why isn't this just easy? And that's maybe a question that we could ask about reading in general, but also reading and translation, right? Does it always need to be easy? Is there some value to being challenged by foreignness, right? And I think that's, in a way, like a political and ethical question, but it's also just a question about reading.
Yeah, it is. And I was recently reading about a small publisher, U.S. publisher, that publishes exclusively, I think, French books, but they're French books that have been controversial throughout history. So their idea is they want to preserve the controversy. They don't want these books to just kind of go away, even though some of them today we read them and are like, oh, that's racist to say that or however, but it's like, this book has value. We want to be able to preserve that, not necessarily the values that it is expressing, but we just think that this is a thing that people should read about, right? Understand.
Right. And that's what's so interesting about the idea of selection, is because every selection, if you think about it, is algorithmic, right? Like, algorithms don't have to only operate on computers. It's like it's basically a program. You run a program for making a decision. So if you're that translation company, you have a sort of series of if-then statements, right? If, this is politically or in some other way culturally important, if it has a danger of being lost, right, then we want to translate it and circulate it. So it's not that, non-Amazon translation publishers aren't running algorithms. They are, but they're valuing something different. And they're not valuing maybe as much the production of data, for example. It's not just about producing more ratings, producing more reviews, because Amazon doesn't even really sell its translations. They're just part of its Kindle subscription package, so most of them. So it's really, for them, translations, and I don't know why translations above other kinds of publications, but translations help them find out something about readers, I think. Like I said, it's sort of thinking about how does a German reader compare to a US reader? If we give them the same book, we're basically part of A/B testing, right? It's like, if this book works for this person, will it work for this person too? And with a translation, you can basically test that. So maybe that's what Amazon is valuing. It's not really even the translation. It's something about us, right? Some amount of data it's able to glean from that translation. Whereas, as you mentioned, another translator might have completely different values. And so without necessarily, I think, maybe your listeners will key in on my own take, but without necessarily saying that one is good and one is bad, maybe what's important is just a diversity of values in the translation space. But we know how, Amazon usually deals with its competitors. So,
yes, and it seems like such a basic idea that if German mystery readers really like this book, then English mystery readers will really like this book. But it seemed, and maybe it just took the kind of data that we're able to collect now on people through the internet and through all of this, big data to maybe bring that into fruition and make it actually a reality and see how it works.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, I've only talked anecdotally to a couple of people. You meet people on an airplane or something, and I'm like, oh, this is what I'm working on. And coincidentally, I met someone who's like, oh, I read Amazon. I have the Kindle subscription. I read a lot of stuff. And I'm like, do you read any translations? And she said, I think so. I don't really know, right? I can't tell. I don't seek them out, but I'm sure, I'm reading some of this. So, what is the value then, of reading the translation if you don't even know it's a translation? And it becomes, it used to be, at least, that people thought this was sort of a marker of cultural prestige, right? I'm reading things in translation. I'm challenging myself and my received ideas. And now it's almost like, well, I don't even know. This could be in translation. Who knows? Could just be set in Italy, right? I don't know. So yeah, I think it's something about testing something about us as readers, which I think, is interesting. And it's something that literary scholars are also interested in. So it's hard to say that there's something wrong about it, because I would like to do it too, right? I would like to know whether, German romance readers are different or similar to US romance readers. But then the sort of question is, what's being done with that data, right? Do people know they're participating in this project or not? But yeah, all those questions are so interesting.
I had a similar thing. A few years ago, I was reading this book. It was kind of different than what I would normally read, but it attracted me. It's by a Norwegian author who was a crime mystery thriller, but it was based on Macbeth. He just basically took Macbeth and turned it into this kind of noir fiction. It was really good. And it was something, I don't know, 6-9 months later after I read the book that I realized that this book was written in Norwegian, and it had been translated into English, and it never really dawned on me. And because it was such a good translation too, and I think it was Penguin or whoever published it, so it was they got the best out there. But it kind of never dawned on me that book was not originally written in English, right? There was nothing about it that said to me that book was Norwegian versus American.
Well, and what's interesting about what you just mentioned too is that that sort of act of global circulation sort of relied on a previous act of circulation, right, which is Shakespeare's texts, which have circulated globally, of course. And we sort of take it as a matter of fact that people around the world know who Shakespeare is, right? When we don't, especially as Americans, know who the great Chinese authors or great Norwegian authors are. You can imagine going somewhere and saying, you don't know who Shakespeare is, right? And you can imagine someone going, well, do you know the great works of my country? And Shakespeare, of course, not American, but part of the great Anglophone literary tradition. So, but yeah, that's really interesting, because probably part of what felt so domesticating maybe about that Norwegian book is that it's relying on source material that you yourself think of as part of your own cultural heritage. And so that's happening more and more, right? There is sort of there's becoming a global cultural literature, basically, if you use literature loosely, right? People all around the world know a lot of different cultural touchstones because of the internet. And so there is this sense that, this sort of mass homogenization of culture in a way, that translation maybe aids to some extent, right? If we're all reading the same thing everywhere. But and that's why maybe this idea of foreignization is so important, that when you are bringing a text from a different place to a new reader, that you're bringing that you're bringing them difference, not just something that is the same, right? So, that's sort of the political edge of translation. Are you just bringing something, trying to make money off of something, or, just increasing its audience, increasing consumption of this cultural product? Or are you trying to bring foreignness to a different place, especially in the US, right? Which is such, its global footprint is so large.
Yeah. And it is this kind of mass homogenization that's kind of a mixed bag. Because in one way you could say, well, maybe it helps to flatten the world and to relate to other people around the world a little better, that we all know who this particular artist is, or this particular author, whoever. But at this same time, there's also value in preserving what makes uniquely, like your unique cultural heritage, right? And preserving that and not having that overtaken or sort of too infused with, American or outside cultural influences.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, and that's one of the questions with the idea of translating popular literature, because these are forms that a lot of people would claim come from the US or England in the first place, right? So the sort of prototypical mystery novel is like Sherlock Holmes or Agatha Christie or something like that. And so you send out the mystery genre and then you import it back. It's written in a different language, but is it really originally a US export? And so maybe an analogy for this would be like K-pop, right? It's like we're consuming a lot of Korean cultural production now, music and films, but are we just sending out the pop genre and then consuming it back, right? I'm obviously not an expert in contemporary music, but what is Korean music, right? Is it K-pop? I mean, it is in a sense, right? But I'm sure there's other Korean music that we don't know anything about because we're getting this sort of domesticated version of it, right, sent back to us.
Yeah, and this reminds me, I used to work at LSU as my first job, and in Southeast Louisiana has a very unique culture. It was, obviously it was French, and New Orleans definitely has this very unique culture. And the last time I went to New Orleans was a few years ago. It was well after Katrina, and so what I sort of noticed was, New Orleans had this unique culture that got packaged and kind of sent out, especially in food products, across the U.S., across the world. And then it kind of got repackaged and sent back to New Orleans. So you go down to these like restaurants and these bars in the French Quarter, and it was like, this is kind of a copy of like an original New Orleans. Like there's very little of that kind of original New Orleans culture left. It gets sent out and repackaged and sent back. And then people think it's authentic, but then I'm kind of like, it's not really. Like there's something missing here.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's always like sort of dangerous, right, to talk about what is the authentic and who gets to judge that. But this idea, I think that's why it's helpful to think about this idea of foreignizing and domesticating, because then you're thinking more on like this kind of like scope of a spectrum, maybe. And maybe, it would be interesting to think about what's easy to consume and what's a little bit harder, more challenging to consume. So that's sort of, especially if we're going back to literature, the easy to consume is the thing that's exactly like you, right? That actually exactly like what you've already read. This is the Italian Colleen Hoover or something like that. And it's like, well, yeah, but we have a Colleen Hoover, and do we need an Italian one? But yeah, so that idea that there's something there that is different, no matter how contemporary the text is, there is something there that's different, but can we preserve that? Is that a value that we are interested in maintaining and circulating? And what is that value, right? What is the value of difference in our sort of globally homogenized world?
Yeah. And you brought up, American music, pop music. And to me, American music is blues and jazz, and then also kind of this kind of country, sort of Appalachian kind of music. And it's not pop music. I think of pop music as coming from England.
Sure.
Sort of, but it is. I guess it's just things, and also things change over generations, and what the current generation might think of as American music, I don't. But then a couple generations later, it's going to be something very different. So it's there is something that seems like it's stagnant.
Yeah, no, that's true, and and the idea of branding, that happens in literature too. So. There's the history of translation in the US, we're actually at sort of a low point. After World War II, there was like sort of a peak in interest by the American audiences for literature and translation. So that's like sort of the age of like Thomas Mann and, where people were reading a lot more in translation. And then in the 60s and 70s, you had sort of an influx of Latin American authors, Spanish language translation. So like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and things like that, especially and happening later too in the 80s and 90s. And that sort of all became understood to be part of this magical realism that was being imported into the US. And so there's actually some interesting work, and I don't work on this, particularly, even though I'm interested in the phenomenon, the idea that every work from South and Central America must be magical realist. And if it's not, we don't translate it because that's not what the audience expects, right? There's this brand now, and these things need to fit into this brand. And now we're with Isabel Allende and some other authors that we've like sort of broken free of that a little bit. And there's also scholars who are like, not everything that is fantasy or, slightly unrealistic and in a South American work is magical realism, but it's been branded that way. And so it's hard, for people to see it as something else.
Right. Yeah. And I wonder those changes in translation, were they linked in any way to like immigration patterns or anything? Or because I think maybe post World War II, I mean, you still had a lot of Western European maybe immigration in America, and especially after World War II, that experience being in Europe, maybe that just provoked an interest, whereas you wait, a few more decades and you have maybe more people coming of age from other parts of the world.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. That's a really interesting question to sort of correlate immigration numbers with what's popular. You could also see an argument, though, that the opposite would be true, because if you have readers of that language in the US, you wouldn't need it to be translated, right? But I think the thing is that we're still talking about so few books that it really is, a lot of these decisions to translate, for example, South American authors can be linked to like one editor at one press, right, who's making this decision and then publishes 2 or 3 authors, and suddenly you have the Latin American boom. So these numbers are like still really small, even though you can see them because they're so small. In a chart, it looks like a huge jump, like 3 Latin American authors, huge stuff. But yeah, I think that's thinking about, global history and what's happening on the global stage, I think is really important when you're thinking about translation. Like, is there a reason suddenly that we're so interested in Korean stuff? Probably, right? Like Korea has definitely come of age as an economy. And I think part of it, though, isn't only demand, it's also the ability to produce, right? They have the money to produce and market their music and their films in a way that probably a lot of countries in the world aren't able to do. And they're still producing things, but, they're not visible on a global stage in the way that, the film industry is a great example of this. You have Hollywood, you have Nollywood in Nigeria, you have Bollywood. And other than that, you can't really think of great film centers. And it's probably not because filmmakers aren't born there or actors are born there, but it's because of the resources partly of that country or that area.
Yeah, and I've always said that the creative industry has a lot of uncreative people. Because if a band or an author, whoever comes along, and usually it's because they're very different than what's out there, so they become very successful, then the thing is, well, we need to copy that, right? So if, Gabriel Garcia Marquez comes along, sells a bunch of books, well, we need the next, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, so let's find people and then there are people out there who maybe just abandon their whole style just to be like that style so that they can get, a book deal or whatever.
Yeah, and this goes back to those forces, right? Like, so you have a readership that's a force, right? If a readership picks up on Gabriel Garcia Marquez, they're reading it, right? They're a force in that. You have the publisher, the publisher who selected that book originally, the translator who made a lot of translation choices, right? Maybe to domesticate it in a certain respect for the American audience. You have the authors themselves, right? So Gabriel Garcia Marquez may himself have decided to publish more magical realist books because of the popular, right? Like, who knows? And then you have people like Oprah, who selected 2 of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's books for her book club, which was like hugely influential in the 90s and early 2000s. So, those are all factors probably that made that book those books what they ended up being, like 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera. By the way, this is just an aside, the Oprah conversation about Love in the Time of Cholera, I think it's available online if you do some digging. And it is like one of my favorite things. It's just like all of these women talking about this, but mostly women talking about this book. And then this man tries to sort of join in. Love and Time of Cholera is kind of about this like very, I don't know, like philandering man, I guess. And a lot of the women are talking about how they don't really like him. They don't really like, that he has all of these partners and it doesn't seem right. And one woman says, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. He's showing all these women a good time. And, there's kind of like all this laughter. And then suddenly this man tries to interject and he says, well, a man like that, he just can't be stopped. And it's like kind of this threatening moment where you're like, wait, what? What did he just say? And Oprah's like, are you serious? And you can see the tone kind of shift. And, Oprah says, so did you like the book? And he gets very bashful and he says, well, I didn't read it. And the crowd just like erupts and laughs at him. And so those are moments where, and that's of course nationally televised, right? And so, first of all, what did that do for the readership of that book? But then also, you see the way that these books build communities and bring people together in a certain way, which I think, we haven't necessarily lost, I would say. We have book talk, we have all these other ways to connect over books, again, that are algorithmically controlled in a way, right? And selected. And so it used to be that Oprah got to choose, who saw what. And is that better or worse than having these algorithms sort of choose what books we can connect over? Who knows? But just being aware of that that's what's happening and that we're in a different time and that books are obviously still a huge part of maybe who we are as a culture, but in a very different way than what used to happen. And, we're sitting here in a library. A library is another place, right? Another place that makes selections and another place where people come together over books.
Yeah. And it's in Oprah as a cultural force. I mean, there's many dissertations, I think, written about that. And I thought at one point she said she was no longer going to pick living authors for that Oprah book club because it was just so kind of unfair to have other authors out there competing. And she was getting people to read Faulkner. I mean, that was just wild to me that Faulkner was one of her selections, and people were out there flocking to read him.
Yeah, you're right. There is a lot of research already on. So I was mainly focused on why did she choose these like international books, which no one had really thought about before. But she had people reading Anna Karenina, which is also like kind of. And in that case, actually, it was one of the only times she told her readers which edition to buy because there were so many translations and they needed to literally be on the same page. And so she like recommended that, and it was like the #1 best-selling book, this old, this translation of Anna Karenina. And, she pitched it as like this sultry romance and people seem to enjoy it. So, which is great.
Yeah. And I was just talking to a guy who was telling me he was taking some sort of peptide, 57 peptide or something. And he's like, I don't know, Joe Rogan is taking this. So everybody just does what Joe Rogan says. So now I'm like, maybe Oprah was Joe Rogan before this.
No, and like right, the original influencer in a way, but like I said, and a lot of money has been spent, especially back, but by publishers to try to figure out what is her selection process, what is the algorithm, right? What is her algorithm for selecting what books she features? And there was always this sort of mystery about it. She makes the selections herself, but of course she can't possibly read all of these books. So someone was recommending books to her. And then, so publishers are handing books to her assistant's grandmother or something, right? Trying to get the assistant to read it and then Oprah to read it because it really had a huge impact on book sales. And there were even processes then, I think, that are probably still being used that were made for Oprah's reveal. So like, bookstores could order the Oprah selection before it was revealed what it was. So they could go to the distributor and say, we'll have this and this many copies of the Oprah selection. And so they would be able to prepare that. So the distributor would know, but nobody else needed to know because it could just be called the Oprah selection. And so all of that, like now probably exists for a lot of different kinds of books, Reese Witherspoon selections, or there's a bunch of other, book clubs still operating. But yeah, she had a huge impact on the whole book industry, the way books are sold and distributed. Yeah, and so now, of course, it's Amazon that has that kind of control, right? About what gets sold and what gets. They have their sort of like just-in-time delivery system, so they order just enough books where they think, they'll. On the one hand, they sort of have all these algorithms and have all this data to think about where these books are going to be needed at what time. So they're distributed out across the US and across the world in these distribution centers. But then they can, of course, also control in a way how many times the book gets bought, if they keep recommending it, et cetera. So who knows to what extent they are responding to the demand for these books and, just like Oprah, creating a demand for the books as well.
Yeah. And at one time, Amazon was doing like a print on demand as well. I don't know if they still do that or not with all the ebooks and everything, but I mean, there's another advantage if you're a small press or whoever, you just can't just print books on demand and be able to ship them out and get them out at any reasonable time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's a lot of benefits in a way to publishers from the Amazon system. For example, used to be very difficult. A bookstore can stock, like, let's say 50,000 books, a small bookstore. A big bookstore, maybe like 150,000. But most of the time, they're going to be prioritizing recent books, books that have been published in the last year or two, and then like classics, right? Like, so they're going to stock books that Shakespeare, something like Anna Karenina, right? Books that people are coming in to buy year after year. So books from like 5 years ago, 10 years ago aren't being stocked. So how is anyone going to find those? And it used to be just that they didn't really, right? So, but now it's very easy. It's very easy to find them if you know where to look, right, on Amazon. And so it's increasing those, what's called the backlist sales, which is a positive for a lot of publishers. So that's one way in which Amazon has shaped the book industry.
Yeah, and there's always, with the good comes the bad, and so there are a lot of advantages to something like Amazon and these huge kind of online retailers who do things that physical retailers can't. But I do find myself, and I'm somebody who is on Amazon way too much and orders way too much stuff from them. And I did laugh that, and so for those of you who know, Anna was part of a panel discussion in the spring, and she'll be another one in the fall on the use of algorithms in our life. And I went home after that talk, and there was an email from Amazon saying, "We think you might like this product." And I was like, I actually really do like this product. It was like a perfect suggestion that I bought, and then I felt kind of bad sort of being controlled by the algorithm. But it's very interesting. And I know one of the other things that you talked about, and I just thought about this the other day because I saw this random post on Instagram, which is a whole other social media and algorithms and all that, but on The Great Gatsby, and talking about how The Great Gatsby was out of print. It didn't actually do all that well in Fitzgerald's lifetime. But then it got this second life as part of these kind of World War II books that got sent out to soldiers across. And then it has taken on its whole life in a couple of movies and everything. But the whole point of it was most people don't seem to understand The Great Gatsby though. It's sort of this love story. They think of it as a love story or sort of this kind of almost like a crime thriller sort of thing. But I think this is the underlying point that Fitzgerald was trying to make in that book.
Right. Yeah. And especially, I have a lot of students who cite that still as their, as one of their favorite novels, partly because I think they think that they're supposed to say something like that. And so they say, this the great American novel. It's like, yeah, but, what is it about? They're like, it's all about the American dream. It's like, well, if it's about the American dream, it's quite a, biting critique of it. Yes. It's not promoting it. So yeah, but that's why literacy is so important.
And then you have all of these other influences on how people perceive it. There was the movie with Robert Redford, and then there was the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. And all of those things play up the big parties and the lavish lifestyle, but it doesn't ever get. I was listening to you. It's because it's the 100th anniversary of Gatsby. I believe it was last year, and I was listening to a podcast with a woman who wrote the introduction on the Centennial Edition, and she's like, that Gatsby, he's just, to use the parlance of our time, he's just a simp. He basically stalks Daisy Buchanan and directs his whole life into becoming rich so he can get the love of this woman who doesn't care, less about him. And it was actually that's a really great point.
Well, and so as you mentioned, that book was selected as part of the Armed Services editions, which were these paperback books that were designed for soldiers to read. They were distributed to soldiers during World War II, only outside of the U.S. This is another great publishing thing because the publishers were afraid that they would compete with the books at home because they were given out for free. And the publishers were like, we will agree to this, these cheap books produced at cost, no profit, right? If they're not distributed in the US. So they could only be distributed in the rest of the world to soldiers. And when I have a chapter on this in my book, and I think mostly about the inclusion of Thomas Mann, because I think that that's super interesting, right? You have a German author, you have soldiers who are, some of whom are in Germany, right, fighting Germans, reading Thomas Mann in a foxhole or something like that. What must that have been like? That idea of foreignness and domestication, right? Like those translations, those early translations were extremely domesticating, but I think it would be difficult. Thomas Mann was a celebrity at the time. It would be difficult to think that you were reading an American author. You're reading a German author. These stories are set in Germany. So there's a lot of interesting stuff happening there, but it would be similarly interesting. As you mentioned, Great Gatsby was out of print in the US. It was easy to be included in this. The publishers were like, sure, go ahead, reprint The Great Gatsby. It'd be really interesting to think about why the soldiers liked it so much. They recommended it to their family at home. They say, like, go out and get yourself a copy of this. Great Gatsby comes back in print. What was it that the American soldier at the time was seeing in The Great Gatsby that they thought was so important or so, entertaining? Is it the same thing that we see now? It's probably something else, right?
Yeah, that is a great question, right? I never even thought about it. So you were just articulating that. You go, oh yeah, that is really great. Like, what is it about that book? It's a book that it's one of the few books I've read multiple times and I really enjoy. But kind of what is it about that? This, probably high school graduate, probably not a college student, college graduate who's out there and who reads this book, and what appealed to him about that?
Right. No, and yeah, you're right. The soldiers at the time were primarily not even high school educated, right? So some of them had completed high school, many of them had not. There's actually a brutal letter in the archives that I went to go look at, where one of the people who was in charge of selecting the books says, we really should be including boys' books because some of the soldiers don't even have the literacy to read the level of books that we're producing, which is of course like sort of crushing. But so yeah, and they're reading Great Gatsby, and they're, on all their letters home, they're like, read this book. So read this book that's really critical of, the American dream and the idea of success in America.
Yeah, and it reminds me of this book I read. This one's called Literature in the Great War. And I went on this kick of reading books about World War I, but in it they have this author has these letters. One's from an officer in the English Army. Of course, this is somebody who's Oxford, Cambridge educated. And then there's this soldier sort of in the trenches who maybe by our standards maybe has a middle school education. And it's fascinating because in these letters home, they're talking about Pilgrim's Progress. And they make the exact same point and the exact same analogy with Pilgrim's Progress. The officer makes it sort of more eloquently, but it's like this amazing thing that you see this big difference in education, but yet able to get, the literacy was there to be able to bring home these points for the books.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think like one of the reasons that we teach literature in college is not so much because we think that, or I guess I should speak for myself instead of using the royal we. The reason that I think it's important is not because necessarily people are going to go on to be authors, of course, or, necessarily even great readers for the rest of their lives. But simply, it's a great sort of playground for critical thinking, for you to think about what's happening and be able to sort of, voice, as you just mentioned, sort of like a critique or an argument about what the book is doing. And it's a really flexible sort of playground to do that, right? And especially in the college classroom, you have all of these students who are reading the same text and then coming up with different ways of making meaning of it. And so when you make meaning, this is what I tell my students, right? You're adding something to our understanding of the text. And ideally that's in some ways different for everybody, right? Like you mentioned, two people can obviously make the same meaning or have the same interpretation of something, but often it can be different. And as long as you can rigorously defend that interpretation and convince someone of it, it can be right? Which is the beautiful thing about the humanities, which is, not as possible in the sciences and detrimental as we've now seen in the sciences. You can't just say, I believe this is right, and it's right? But so this is what's great. What's great about it is like reading, thinking, and then articulating. These are skills that everybody needs, and literature really lets us do that. And as you mentioned, you don't even really need a ton of education to be able to do that, because it's that critical thinking is just a skill, right? It's a skill that hopefully you have, but you can always make better.
Yeah. And then the same author went on to point out that, in the sort of 19 teens England, going to the theater was very expensive. You couldn't do that if you're working class. Radios were a thing, but again, you couldn't afford that. So, how did you entertain yourself? Well, you entertained yourself by reading. And there were actually, again, books produced directed at working class English families, and they typically were selected seemingly by a sort of upper class women, but it was this idea of also that these books would have some sort of moral virtuistic influence on these folks' life, and so you would read the same book over and over and over again. You'd have a couple of them, and it sort of really sort of drilled home the points, but also helped you to really understand the book and critique and break down its arguments.
Right. Yeah. And I think rereading is really important. And you always learn something new, right? And which is also really interesting. You're I've already read this. And it's well, actually, if you read it again, you're going to see something else, which is what you don't get when you ask ChatGPT to summarize the books for you. But it's funny too. I do sometimes get students sort of thinking that what we're doing in the college classroom when we talk about books is trying to figure out who's right and who's wrong, which is sort of moralistic reading, was Don Quixote right or wrong for doing this? Don Quixote, for those of you who don't know, is this famously sympathetic dunce of a character who just misreads everything in his life. He has this friend named Sancho Panza who he drags into all these misadventures. And it's the sort of paradox of it is, you have this narrator who's also very funny and just constantly deriding Don Quixote. He's Don Quixote, what an idiot, right? He thinks that these windmills are giants. Clearly they're not. He thinks he's in a genre novel when he's in his real life, right? And so he's misreading everything. But why are we so sad at the end where, spoiler alert, right? He's I've been wrong all along. I can't believe I was such a bad reader. And you're no, Don Quixote, right? Why are we sad? So it's not, right? Maybe one question we could ask is Don Quixote right or wrong? But to me, that's kind of a boring question, right? Is he bad or is he good? Well, I don't know, and I don't really care. What I'm more interested in is what does the novel want us to get out of this, right? Why does the novel paint Don Quixote as such a frustrating, sort of awful person, and then also make us love him, right? So that's the more interesting question, I think. What does the novel do? So that's when I always try to sort of twist what my students' conversations, instead of is Sancho Panza, right, bad for sort of goading, because he often goads Don Quixote on, even when he knows what's happening is not quite right, if it behooves him, right? If he's going to get money out of it or something like that. So instead of asking, is Sancho Panza good or bad? What does the novel think Sancho Panza's role is? And, why is he here? Why is he here for the novel to work? It's a more interesting question, and I think allows us to sort of reflect critically more. But you're right. I mean, historically, books have been moral guides, and I'm not saying that they can't be, right? But I think it's more interesting to think about the novel as a whole, what the novel as a whole is doing, instead of using these sort of individual characters as, as black or white, sort of heroes or antagonists. Yeah.
And there is something, and it's been a long time since I've read Don Quixote, but he is you empathize with him so much, and you root for him and you feel for him. And the question is why? What about him touches you as a human being? And I had this conversation with John Harris, who used to be the dean of College of Engineering Sciences, now the provost at Missouri S&T, and we were talking about AI and art, and his point was AI could make art, and that you would hang it on your wall or read it or whatever, that there was no difference. And my point was, well, one, humans gave up on making pretty art a while ago, but that's a whole other conversation. But I said there's something about great art that touches you as a human being, and only one human being creating that can touch another human being. That AI can read all of the whatever poetry that it wants, but it still can't take its emotion and express it, because it doesn't have an emotion, and express it in a way that touches another humans.
Yeah, I think the question that we need to ask ourselves about that is, what is art for? And if art is for looking pretty on a wall, then I think ChatGPT can produce it, right? If art is about art and literature, right, all of that, if that's about us thinking about and talking to each other about the human condition and what it means to be human and to experience the world, then ChatGPT can absolutely not produce it. I don't think anyone would argue that it can, right? Because, I mean, it does not have anything, nominally near an experience of the world. All it has is language. And that, coincidentally, right, is what we study in the literature classroom, the relationship between language and the world. But the relationship between language and the world is basically communal, right? We decide what it is. If I use language in a certain way, it means something to you because we live in one community. And this goes back to translation, right? If I speak to someone, a Japanese person who doesn't speak English, my language means nothing to them because we don't live in the same community. Or if I talk to someone from 100 years ago or 100 years in the future, my language will mean differently because we understand language differently. So the way ChatGPT uses language doesn't have any relationship to an experience of the world. And so when I look at art or I read literature by a person, I know that I'm experiencing, in a way, someone else's experience of the world. And that's what's valuable to me, right? This is one way of understanding the world that I don't know yet. And by knowing it, or by trying to understand it, I'm going to gain something of value, which is, a critique of the world, a different way of looking at the world, a different way of feeling about the world. That is not, the ChatGPT's linguistic approximation of the world, to me, not valuable in doing that. So I'm not interested in it.
Yeah, and it's much like, I had dreams of being the great American novelist at one point as an 18, 19-year-old, whatever, 16-year-old, whatever, and having read a lot and knew a lot of big words, but had no life experience, right? So I can use all these big words, but they don't mean anything because there's nothing, I can't actually talk about anything because I haven't experienced anything, right? And it's that life experience that is valuable. And having processed the world and how do you view it and how can you explain it and bring that to somebody else?
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's the thing. It's like all this cultural production. And that's why, to bring it sort of full circle. And I do want to caveat what I just said, which was that I don't care about ChatGPT. I care about it as an interesting, right, technology and something that's obviously going to affect our students and us, but I don't care about it as a producer of literature per se, right? It's an interesting producer of language, certainly. But yeah, so to bring it sort of full circle, it goes back to this idea of selection, right? What are we valuing when we select things? What is Amazon Crossing valuing when it selects things to translate versus a human publisher, right? Is a human publisher trying to bring more meaning into our world, right? By introducing us to a foreign text that is, formally innovative or, speaking to a feeling or a concept or an event that we're not familiar with in the US? Or is it trying to produce more data on us, right? So those are different values. And so I'm always, I guess, on the side of increasing meaning.
Yeah. And as I'm someone who always talks about values, your values should underline everything that you do and support everything that you do. And so then that's answering why am I doing this? Well, it's because of my values, right? And in that, right, we're going to find meaning in our life and in the world. So.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, well, thank you very much, Anna. It's been a great conversation. It was a lot of fun. And any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
Well, I want to thank you, Jason, for having me. And I want to, any of your listeners who are Florida Tech students, if this has been interesting to you, maybe enroll in a literature class with me or with one of our other great literature faculty.
Yeah, it's a great thing. Reading books is just the best thing you can do. It's the best habit to pick up, and it's a great way to explore the world and explore life and to be able to think for yourself.
Absolutely, and it's more fun than calculus.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Anna. It's been a pleasure.
All right, thank you.